if you're a leader in an organization, thinking about two things. One is with everything you do, whether it's a policy update, whether it's a change to your hiring form, whether it's the hiring of somebody who oversees diversity, is it building trust? Firstly, is it intended to build trust? And then secondly, is it actually building trust? Do people now have more trust? Do people have more knowledge? And I think if you're doing that, that's your gauge to know that it's not performative, right? If people are feeling safer, more comfortable, more supported, then you do you.
Welcome to ABCDEI, a podcast that explores topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion through stories of distinct and powerful lived experiences.
If you are tired of the preaching, shaming, and theory about why inclusion matters and just want to create change already, then you're in the right place.
Join us as we unlearn bias one alphabet at a time. My name is Susan Diaz.
And I'm Rohini Mukherjee.
Hello and welcome back to ABCDEI. Rohini, do you want to set up our guest?
So I'm excited to introduce Ben Borne, who is the co-founder of Symmetry PR, lives in Saskatchewan. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much. It's truly a pleasure to be here today with both of you.
I think one of the questions I have for you is, how can we center our Indigenous colleagues? How can we center Indigenous sentiment and voices, especially when something horrific like the discovery of the bodies in Kamloops happens? And how do we get past performative flags at half-mast and listening to real change that we're opening ourselves up for?
That's a big can of worms we're opening. It's amazing how many people actually kind of reached out in the last few days to me that I don't really know who they are that well, but just know that I am Indigenous and this and that. Like, hey, this is obviously a really significant event. I think while this moment, there's all the performative stuff is nice, right? It's nice, but I think what I've appreciated more than anything else is witnessing the vulnerability of people who are willing to go there, who are willing to say, well, for example, I have a friend who's a teacher, and she shared some very personal stories about working with students and, about her experience of the education system growing up now and how she's making a difference in her work or how she wants to make a difference in her work. And I was very moved by that. We haven't been in touch for a very long time, but I was like, I really appreciate hearing how this settler person is being so vulnerable about their experience, about their gaps, and what they're doing to address it. And it wasn't necessarily an in-person conversation, but I know that I could probably reach out to this person to have a really good, vulnerable conversation. But it really comes down to people meeting the moment with honesty, authenticity, vulnerability, connection, and a desire to know and to be better. I think, that speaks volumes, right? When we're talking about meeting our colleagues, we could do lots of different. We could offer EAP programs, employee assistance programs. We could do, lots of things. But for me, it's about how are we going to advance our interpersonal relationships to learn and to be better. And I think that's really vague, but that's also something that's really important, I think, in the Indigenous context. Indigenous people value storytelling so much, right? Where relationships are so important, and I think that needs to come out into play. As each individual, we need to find ways to connect and to really honestly share about this, because honestly, it takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of vulnerability to say, the education school system failed me. I didn't know And I'm going to try to make that better in my day-to-day. And this is how I'm going to do it. And I talked to my kids about it in school today. And, or maybe it's a person having a conversation with their own children at home, right? There's, you got to take personal steps, right? And I think that's hard for people to really grasp. What can I do? But really it starts with education. It comes with knowing in your heart the truth, and then going from there and expressing that through action, reconciliation, right? It's learning, knowing, and then acting. And I think that's important. That's ultimately what we got to do.
I really love what you said there about the value of the stories, and just start there with, just hearing, learning more. May I ask you, Ben, like one of the things that I come into contact with a lot with people is I'm going to be quiet because I don't know what to say, or I don't want to say the wrong thing. And my answer is usually like, just say something, because silence, as far as I'm concerned, is not the greatest option. So what might you have to offer by the way of, advice for people who are like, I really don't know what to say and I'm afraid to say the wrong thing?
Also a really good question. It's funny. As an Indigenous owned business, we haven't said much yet, right? That's because I'm still figuring out my voice in this conversation, right? And we're still figuring out, because you see it everywhere. You see the orange squares everywhere, the images everywhere, but I'm like, I need to let those who need to speak first, right? And then when my time comes, I'll have something to say. But I think, again, it comes down to facing or embracing vulnerability, embracing the emotional risk and exposure of being wrong and being corrected, and learning from that, or to admit that you didn't know, right? Right. Or simply say, this has been awful to hear about, and I'm not really sure what to say. And I need to take space to understand, and I'm going to go learn about this. Right. Yeah. And that goes for a lot of different situations when there's such tragedy, or such, like you see it when people die, you see it when people are, facing just egregiously terrible situations. Some people just don't know what to say because they can't be empathetic. Right. Mm-hmm. But do your best to meet the moment with empathy, if anything. Right. Sympathy doesn't go far, but connection, empathy, vulnerability, important. As communicators and as businesses, it's about taking the chance to work with other and partner with Indigenous people to say, hey, what can we learn from you to improve our processes, to improve our systems, to reframe how we think about things? Because, you probably would have a similar experience as this, coming into some organizations, but when organizations hire other folks from other cultures and backgrounds, that always brings different flavors and attitudes to cultures and systems. And so organizations need to be in a position to embrace that and to adapt and to reshape how their culture works, right? And it's the same thing that when you're embracing indigeneity in your organization, it's not just doing it for the allyship, for the performative allyship, right? It's about saying we're ready to open ourselves up to you, really reshaping, rethinking how we talk about ourselves, how we think about ourselves, how we interact with others. Because as communicators, our role is to be a voice, to listen, and to reflect information back to leadership and to help shape culture.
Here we are with Darian Kovacs, who is a seasoned podcast host and founder of Jelly Marketing. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me here.
So to get the sort of chat started today, Darian, I know that Rohini and I were keen to get your input on the idea, which kind of stemmed from a question that we were asked a while ago, which is, isn't all sort of marketing / communications, and for those who are just listening, this is, I'm doing air quotes at the moment, isn't all of it just sort of performative if you're setting out to tell people that this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm fixing it and this is how I'm making change? So maybe if we can get started chatting about what is that line? Like when people are like, ooh, I'm just becoming aware of things. I'm just becoming aware, whether it was the George Floyd event of last year or the unearthing of like over 1,000 children's graves. These are things that I think in the consciousness of many people is just like, this is the first time it's becoming real. Like in the past, it was just something buried deep in history. It was not your experience. So where do they start, or we start as people, especially people at work, start to find that line between performative and actual real change?
Yeah, I'll tell a story. I was recently invited to come on CTV News because a clothing brand in Regina called 22 Fresh used and had an Indigenous child in their ad campaigns. The mother had their child in it, and the child looked awesome and had these beautiful braids, and it was the coolest thing. The mother was super stoked and really proud of it. The brand was really proud of it, and it made the news that they did this. And the saddest part of it was that it made the news, but the most exciting part of it was that it made the news. So the sad part being is that it was news that a brand would actually have Indigenous people in their advertising, as their stock images or as their models wearing the clothing, and that was so sad that was newsworthy and exciting, and this is happening. The exciting part is on the flip side, being Indigenous, it was very cool that brands are coming to light, and it's one of those, it's not too late would be my thing. And I want to encourage all brands who maybe have been discouraged or scared to do anything. And I think that's been the biggest issue, is that I just don't want fear, or a big one is, paralysis by analysis, to stop people from doing something that 22 Fresh did. And 22 Fresh, you might not have ever heard of them. They're a small brand out of Regina, but if you've heard of brands like Hudson's Bay Company and Sephora and all these other brands, it'd be so cool if they took and followed 22 Fresh's lead. And I think the issue in marketing and advertising, though, is that, Sephora is one of those incredible brands that actually took an amazing lead in doing something cool. And on National Indigenous Day in Canada, they actually hired Indigenous writers, videographers, makeup artists, people on set, and every position was an Indigenous person. And they did this incredible video. And the sad part, though, again, the fear and the worry and the concern around doing this was that they got so much criticism because they left out Afro-Indigenous people. And I want to say Sephora did a great job, and they were trying. And I think I want to speak to the Sephoras, that are listening to the show, and the other brands that are maybe considering to do what 22 Fresh did, to say, trying is okay. Like attempting at something is actually okay. About 5 years ago, Sephora actually had an Indigenous advocate, incredible woman, kind of leader, spokesperson, actually in an ad campaign. And this was years ago. And so that's why I'm mentioning Sephora again, because they got blasted for attempting something that was really cool. But I feel like they actually were doing something before it was fashionable and before it was kind of on trend.
I think the other thing too is that, we've had, I think last summer we saw a huge spike in the hiring of, VPs of diversity and directors of diversity. And now we're starting to see burnout among that group and people leaving those roles. And I think it is, it's, if you're a leader in an organization, thinking about two things. One is, with everything you do, whether it's a policy update, whether it's a change to your hiring form, whether it's the hiring of somebody who oversees diversity, is it building trust? Firstly, is it intended to build trust? And then secondly, is it actually building trust? Do people now have more trust? Do people have more knowledge? And I think if you're doing that, that's your gauge to know that it's not performative, right? If people are feeling safer, more comfortable, more supported, then you do you. And the other part of that is then it has to be a senior role, and it has to have authority and influence. So if it is a role that can be done away with or reports to levels of the organization that might be part of the problem, then I think it's not building trust. And in the long term, it won't build trust. So to me, it sort of comes back to trust and influence, which, I mean, those are words that marketers and advertisers and PR people, that's what we live by, right?
Leo, welcome to ABCDEI.
Thank you so much for having me, Rohini, this afternoon. I'm honored to be here.
I think one of the things that, we had chatted briefly about, especially in the context of charitable partnerships, is, and you had talked to us a little bit about how sometimes in the journey to serving the communities that we want to uplift and we want to support and we want to advocate for, there is a risk of sometimes losing our way around who we're serving. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. There is a quick, I often like to call it sometimes knee-jerk reactions, right? People live in a particular community for a long time, and one researcher goes ahead and does a research and publish some horrific statistics. And people are like, wow, and you see funders clamoring now to say, we want to help, right? And I often say this to organizations, whether you're a BIPOC organization or a non-BIPOC organization, it doesn't even matter to me because it's across the board. You are not supposed to be the servants of funders. You are not supposed to be the representatives of funders. I think that is a misunderstanding of the role that you should be playing based on the commitments that you've made to communities and victims of these situations. Instead, I think we should be advocates. And what that means is this: if all we're doing is working hard day and night to meet the requirements of the funders, I wonder who's being left behind. I wonder who's being ignored. I wonder whose voices are not being brought to bear. Because if all we're doing is submitting a report to the funders in accordance with the requirements that we were given, I wonder which part of the report is not making it in the report. If all we are reporting about is the 10 requirements, I wonder all the other things that may have happened that are of significant importance. That when I read reports from nonprofit, I'm often struck how people find it acceptable that everything just went well. They just met all the 10 requirements and it just looked great and it just fits in with the funding requirements. That is not humanly possible. It is not. I care less how great of an organization you are, which staff you've got. It's not humanly possible that you just perfectly met these numbers like this and in isolation of itself, and there were no other issues or things. So what is it that is not making it in those reports? I wonder. Are funders prepared to get the entire report and not just a portion of the 10 requirements? Should they be? So I think organizations need to start asking themselves that, what is our role? Why are we the servants? Are we representatives of the funders? Or are we in a position of power to be advocates for the same communities that the funders are saying they want to help anyway? What's so bad about hearing the voices of the very people that you really want to help, so dearly want to support? So I think community organizations, BIPOC or non-BIPOC, should now start to bring to the table the full understanding of the community as it is, even if it directly contradicts what the funders think they want or they're asking for. It is an opportunity of education. I think that's where we are. We should be advocates and educators of funders to help them better understand what is the connection with you and your enormous resources and these communities that are finding a way to deal with the deficits that they've been confronted with.
I think you said that well. Making the communities and the purposes that you're serving dictate the agenda, and not your own sort of quote unquote corporate or whatever it is that you're trying to prove. The wrong sort of metrics or the wrong factors are being applied to the thing. And I so agree with what you're saying there. Sometimes I know, there's endless things we can say about it. There's so many stories we can use to illustrate. But in terms of like key takeaways? Like if you're talking directly to some of these companies, where do you tend to tell them to start looking for the change to this? Because the fact remains that is the main operating sort of system that runs most of it. And bringing that change is desirable, but nobody's getting around to it. So where would they start, Leo?
There's a few very practical. I like to be practical, and there are endless lists of things that we can talk about. But I will start by being practical. Number one, I give an example. When these issues happen and companies or funders say they want to talk to Black BIPOC community members, right, to get understanding. So everybody's calling you. Everybody wants you at a table, right? All these tables they're calling you to. However, we know in time past, these very tables, people who came to this table as consultants or whoever, got paid a lot of money to come and do the work that we're called to do. Here I am. I get 10 to 20 calls a day from multiple tables, but I'm just supposed to go there and participate and give my great ideas and come back home, right? How come, not because I don't call myself a consultant or put a certain name on me, how come nobody thinks that it is only fair for you to account for the value of that work you're asking of me the same way you would have paid Deloitte? The same way you would have paid any other consultant had you brought them to the table to say, we want to organize 3 town halls with BIPOC communities. We need you as a consultant to set it up. They would send you a bill. Now, this is where some of the deficit comes in, because in our community, people don't see themselves. People have been taught to devalue their knowledge. They've been taught to devalue what they have. So I get 10 different committees in the city calling me to sit on the table because they feel my knowledge or my experience or my expertise would be great in informing this. But I'm supposed to do all of this as a volunteer and then have a full-time job at the same time to feed my family and take care of my responsibilities. So one of the things companies and funders can start to do, start to add value to the knowledge and participation and ability of BIPOC community members that you are asking to come and do this difficult and dangerous job. Because let me tell you why it's dangerous. I said the same thing about different police forces that I work with. You call me all the time to want to work with BIPOC communities. I go to young kids in the Black community to try and help them understand how can they understand that the police is here to protect them and their friends, and they should not be afraid of them. And 2 weeks later, they come back to me that a police officer just carded them downtown. You know what you've done to my reputation? As a BIPOC community member, as a leader in my community, you know what you've just done? I can't go back to that kid. How am I going to go back to that kid and say another thing to them in the same community when I just betrayed them by letting them open up to a police officer who carded them down the street when I told them that the police should not do that? And it's the same thing with companies. You bring BIPOC community members to these tables, there are enormous risks because sometimes the things we tell you, you do not follow it. But when our communities see us at these tables, they assume that those tables are supposed to do the right thing, because how would have someone like Leo participated and this outcome is like this, even though if my advice was not taken, right? That's one. Number two, let's get it straight up. Please stop setting your 10 requirements for the funding without the inclusion of the voices of the people you want to serve. Please stop coming to organizations and asking them to do things that are impossible. You come to me and you give me $20,000 to support 50 Black children who are struggling in school. And you want the money to be spent for books, for snacks, for bus tickets, great. So who's going to pay the quality of staff that's supposed to be there? Who's going to pay the rent for the building that we're supposed to use? Who's going to pay for the electricity that we're supposed to flip on every day? Who's going to pay for the insurance for the risk involved if something goes wrong? So stop giving people money to pay for programs. Start investing in organizations. Because if you like the work that an organization is doing, then don't pay for the programs, because the programs are happening in isolation. We should be comfortable to say we will fund an organization with $20,000 to support 50 Black children. And don't come and do the itemized budget for me, bus tickets, snacks, this. No, because at the end of the year, I still have to produce you a financial report anyway to say how I spend the money. It's okay to put parameters around it, that I can spend it for my own luxury, that I can spend it for something else. But you might as well become the ED of the organization then if you're going to just itemize the budget for me down to every penny and every cent. Because that's not how our work evolves. All of a sudden, we bring 50 kids to help them with their schoolwork. And while they were here at school, one of them, we realized that does not have winter jacket. So he might not go to school the entire winter, or he might walk in the cold the entire winter to go to school. Now I have to make a decision to provide a winter jacket for the kid. Oh, I cannot do it because the $20,000 is itemized to the dollar. So I think these are I'm using this as institutional examples because funders like to talk about, the high level things that they can do. I am saying to them, you're either going to trust BIPOC communities to work with them, and that doesn't mean it will go well either. Some of them will fail. Some of them may not work. But guess what? That is where the character, the test, that's a real test of our character. Are we committed to the process of building and dealing with the deficits, or are we only committed to picking and choosing the people who we think will meet our expectations? Are we willing to be disappointed and still remain committed to the process and deal with the challenges that made us to not succeed?
If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to hit subscribe and please drop us a review. If you want to learn more about us or the ABCDEI podcast, visit abcdei.ca.